In the middle of a packed Manhattan ballroom surrounded by tailored suits and practiced smiles, Charlotte Hayes walked onto the dance floor with a man no one recognized. He wore no watch worth mentioning, no name badge that meant anything to anyone in the room. Within seconds, the laughter started low, at first, then open and deliberate. Victor Langford, her ex, stood near the bar and let his voice carry across the room. "Really, Charlotte, that's what you've downgraded to?" The crowd turned. Some smiled. Most stared. And then, not 5 minutes later, the ballroom doors opened and everything changed. Charlotte had not planned to stay long. She had told herself that before leaving her apartment, 1 hour, maybe 90 minutes, enough to show her face and collect 2 or 3 business cards that might actually matter. The event was called a networking evening, but everyone in the room understood what it really was, a place where people came to be seen by the right people and to make sure the wrong ones knew where they stood. The grand ballroom of the Meridian Hotel had that effect on people. It made them perform. She arrived a few minutes after 8, handed her coat to the attendant, and stepped inside. The room was lit the way expensive rooms always are, warm, without being soft, bright enough to show off the clothes, and dim enough to forgive the faces. A string quartet played near the far wall, something classical and decorative that no one was actually listening to. Waiters moved between clusters of guests, carrying champagne flutes, and the hum of curated conversation filled the air like a second soundtrack. Charlotte took a glass from a passing tray and moved toward the interior of the room. She recognized faces, a few clients, a senior partner from an agency she had pitched to last spring, a woman she had met at a conference in Chicago, who always looked like she was about to interrupt someone. Charlotte nodded where it was appropriate, smiled where it was necessary, and kept moving. She was good at this. She had learned how to work a room without letting the room work her. What she had not accounted for was Victor. She spotted him near the bar before he saw her, or at least before he chose to acknowledge that he saw her. He was laughing with a group of men she didn't recognize, all of them, in suits that announced money without stating a specific number. Victor always had that quality. He knew how to occupy a room, how to make his presence feel like an event. When they were together, she had found it charming. Now, watching him from across the ballroom, she mostly found it exhausting. She turned in the other direction and decided to make her 90 minutes count somewhere else. That was when she noticed Adrien Cole. He was standing near the edge of the room, slightly apart from the nearest cluster of guests, with a glass of water in his hand, rather than champagne. His suit was dark and well-fitted, but carried none of the deliberate signaling that filled the rest of the room. No pocket square, no cufflinks catching the light, nothing that said, "Look at me." He was watching the room the way someone watches a film they've already seen, not bored exactly, but not surprised either. He didn't look like he was waiting for someone to notice him. He looked like he was perfectly comfortable not being noticed at all. Charlotte found herself walking toward him without fully deciding to. She told herself she was simply moving away from Victor's corner of the room, which was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. There was something about the stillness of the man that cut against the noise of everything around him, and she was tired of noise. She stopped a few feet away and glanced at the same stretch of room he was looking at. "You look like you're doing the math on how long you have to stay," she said. Adrien turned to look at her. His expression didn't shift dramatically. He wasn't startled, wasn't performing surprise. He just looked at her with a calm, even attention that she wasn't entirely used to receiving in a room like this one. "I already know how long I have to stay," he said. "I'm just deciding whether the time is being well spent." Charlotte considered that. "And still deciding," Adrien said. She introduced herself, Charlotte Hayes, marketing currently independent. He gave his name without a title, without a company, without the reflexive elevator pitch that almost everyone in the room had ready at all times. Just Adrien Cole. She waited for the rest of it, and it didn't come, and she found she didn't mind. They talked for a while, not about deals or portfolios or who they knew in common, but about smaller things. The acoustics of the room, the particular exhaustion of events, where everyone is friendly but no one is honest. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, he didn't fill the silence with noise just to fill it. Somewhere in the course of the conversation, Charlotte stopped noticing the rest of the room. She later couldn't say exactly who suggested the dance. The quartet had shifted into something slower, and the small area of open floor near the musicians had filled with a few couples moving in loose, unhurried circles. It might have been a natural progression of standing close to someone in a quiet moment. It might have been the champagne, though she'd only had one glass. Either way, when the moment came, she didn't hesitate. She stepped toward the floor, and Adrien followed. What happened next was not her fault, though that wouldn't matter to anyone watching. Victor saw them from across the room. She became aware of this in the way you become aware of weather changing a shift in pressure rather than a visible sign. Then she heard his voice pitched just loud enough to carry the way he always pitched things when he wanted an audience without appearing to want one. "Well, look at that." Victor's tone was light, almost amused, the vocal equivalent of a raised eyebrow. He was speaking to the men beside him, but his eyes were fixed on Charlotte. "She's dancing with the help." A few people near him laughed, the quick reflex laughter of people who didn't want to be left out of whatever was happening. Someone else said something Charlotte couldn't catch, and Victor's smile widened. He raised his glass slightly in her direction, the gesture designed to look like a toast, but landing like a verdict. "Charlotte always did have interesting taste," he said louder this time. "I just didn't realize she was going for the budget option." The laughter spread. It wasn't the whole room, but it was enough of the room to matter, enough heads turning, enough attention swinging in her direction that the couple nearest to Charlotte and Adrien stepped back, slightly creating a small, uncomfortable clearing around them. She felt it, the exposure of it, the way the space around her suddenly felt like a stage. She had two options, and she understood both of them clearly. She could step off the floor, reclaim her champagne glass from wherever she'd left it, and let the moment dissolve into the general noise of the evening. Victor would declare a small, quiet victory and move on. The room would find something else to watch within minutes. She could make it easy, or she could stay. Charlotte kept her eyes forward. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at the people who were still watching. She kept her posture level and her expression steady, and she stayed on the floor. Adrien had not changed his stance. He had not stiffened or flushed or looked toward the source of the laughter. His hand remained where it was, and his movements stayed exactly as unhurried as they had been. He gave no sign of being troubled by what was happening, which was either extraordinary composure or something closer to indifference. She couldn't tell which, and she found she didn't need to tell right now. What she knew was that she had made her choice, and she intended to stand in it. Victor said something else from across the room, but by then Charlotte had stopped processing the specific words. They reached her as sound, rather than meaning background noise, like the quartet, like the clinking of glasses, like all the careful, calculated performances happening simultaneously in every corner of the Meridian Grand Ballroom. She let it be noise. She let it stay noise. The song continued. The floor stayed under her feet, and somewhere on the other side of the room, behind the light and the laughter and the studied ease of Victor Langford's performance, the doors to the ballroom hadn't yet opened. But they were about to. The laughter didn't stop when the song ended. That was the thing Charlotte hadn't anticipated. She had expected the moment to dissolve once the music shifted, once the room found something else to absorb its attention. But Victor had timed it well, the way he timed most things. He had made it a story, and stories had a way of outlasting their original moment. She could feel it moving through the room in real time, person to person, the particular ripple of shared amusement that required no further explanation. She and Adrien stepped off the floor, and the stares followed them. A woman near the champagne station leaned toward her companion and said something behind her hand. The companion glanced over, then looked away quickly when Charlotte met her eyes. Two men standing near the windows were watching Adrien with the specific expression people use when they're trying to determine whether someone belongs somewhere, the slow assessing look that arrives at its conclusion before the evidence is fully in. Charlotte had seen that look directed at other people before. She had never been on the receiving end of it, not in a room like this one, and it sat differently than she would have expected. It didn't make her angry. It made her tired in a way that felt older than the evening. Victor wasn't finished. He had moved slightly from his original position near the bar, closer now, angling into the natural traffic flow of the room, the way someone does when they want to appear casual while ensuring they're visible. He caught Charlotte's eye and smiled the easy, practiced smile she had once found reassuring and now understood as a tool. "I'm not trying to embarrass you," he said at his voice carrying the particular warmth of someone who absolutely was. "I just think you deserve better than a man who can't even afford the parking at an event like this." The men with him laughed on cue. Victor's smile held patient and satisfied the smile of a man who believed he had just said something both true and generous. Adrien said nothing. He stood beside Charlotte, with the same unhurried composure he'd carried since she first noticed him, near the edge of the room, and he did not look at Victor. He looked at the room not defiantly, not with performance of any kind. He simply looked at it the way he'd been looking at it all evening, as though he were still completing an assessment whose outcome he already suspected. Charlotte kept her expression level. She had learned years ago that reacting visibly in front of Victor was the one thing he actually wanted, because reaction confirmed that he still had leverage. She denied him that, the same way she had stayed on the floor, and she could tell by the slight flicker at the edge of his smile that he registered the denial. The room eventually returned to itself, not fully, but enough. Conversations resumed. The quartet found a new piece. The waiters continued their circuits, but the awareness of Charlotte and Adrien lingered a low-grade attention from people who had filed the situation away and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. She was about to suggest they move to a quieter part of the room when the ballroom doors opened. Not the side doors that guests had been filtering in and out of all evening, but the main entrance, the wide formal doors at the far end of the ballroom that were typically opened for arrivals of significance. They opened now with a quiet authority that drew eyes simply by virtue of the sound. 4 men entered in a tight cluster, all of them in dark suits, all of them moving with the particular efficiency of people who had places to be and had learned to move through social spaces without slowing down for them. They were not guests in the ordinary sense. They did not collect champagne from a passing tray or scan the room for familiar faces. They scanned the room for one specific face. The one at the front found it immediately. He changed direction without breaking stride, cutting across the floor toward Charlotte and Adrien, and the 3 behind him adjusted their course in the same motion. Charlotte watched them come. She felt Adrien shift slightly beside her. Not a retreat, more like a man settling into a different posture, the way someone stands differently when they move from one room into another. The man at the front extended his hand. "Mr. Cole," his voice was measured professional, carrying the specific weight of someone accustomed to being heard in rooms where several conversations were happening simultaneously. "The board has been waiting for you. We have the Hargrove acquisition on the table, and Mercer wants your read before the room locks in." Adrien took the handshake. "Give me 5 minutes," he said. The man nodded once, and the 4 of them moved to a respectful distance, not far enough to be dismissed, close enough to signal that the 5 minutes were being counted. The ballroom did not erupt. It did not gasp or exclaim. What it did was quieter and more complete than either of those things. It went still. The particular stillness of a room in which several dozen people have simultaneously revised an assumption they didn't know they were holding. Conversations thinned out in real time, not because anyone stopped talking, but because the portion of each person's attention devoted to the exchange at the center of the room expanded until it crowded out almost everything else. Victor had gone quiet. Charlotte noticed this without looking directly at him. She became aware of it the way she had become aware of his laughter earlier, as a change in the quality of the air rather than a specific observable fact. The men who had been laughing with him were no longer laughing. One of them had his phone out, and from the focused, rapid way his thumb was moving, he was searching for something. A name, most likely. The information moved through the room, the way information always moves in rooms full of people whose business depends on knowing things quickly and without announcement. Charlotte could track it in real time, the small adjustments of posture, the recalibrated glances, the way two women near the bar leaned together, and then both turned to look at Adrien, with expressions that had nothing in common with the expressions they'd been wearing 3 minutes ago. Someone near the window said a name she caught only the fragment, Cole Capital, and she watched the person beside him process it with visible effort, the way you process something that forces you to recalculate. Adrien Cole. The name hadn't meant anything to her when he gave it without a title. She understood now that this was likely by design. Cole Capital was a technology acquisition fund that had been moving through the city's business landscape for the past 2 years, with the quiet speed of something that doesn't need to announce itself. It didn't advertise. Its founder didn't do interviews. What it did was acquire carefully selectively and at a scale that had made several established firms take notice in ways they hadn't expected to need to. Charlotte knew the name the way most people in her field knew it, as a fixture of industry conversation, present everywhere and visible nowhere. She had not until this moment connected it to a face. She looked at Adrien. He was watching her in the same way he had been watching her since she first spoke to him near the edge of the room, with that calm, even attention that she had initially read as ease, and was now recalculating entirely. She didn't know what to do with the recalculation. The man beside her was the same man she had been talking to for the past hour, and he was also a completely different set of facts than she had been given, and she wasn't certain those two things were compatible. The shift in the room became physical. People began moving toward them, not rushing, not obviously, but with the gradual gravitational drift of people who have decided that a particular location is now where the interesting things are happening. A man in a gray suit appeared at Adrien's shoulder, with his hand extended and a wide, uncomplicated smile saying something about a shared connection at a conference in Boston. A woman Charlotte vaguely recognized from the financial sector arrived a half-step behind him, already mid-sentence. Adrien received them both with the same composure he'd shown all evening, brief and courteous, not particularly warm. Victor appeared within the next 2 minutes. He had composed himself. That much was clear. The easy confidence had returned to his face, the smile reset to its default setting, open collegial, suggesting a history of warmth that didn't require verification. He approached Adrien with the air of a man who intends to make a joke at his own expense before anyone else has the chance to, which is the particular strategy of someone who has calculated that preemptive self-deprecation costs less than silence. "I owe you an apology," Victor said, directing it at Adrien with a slight inclination of his head that managed to suggest sincerity without fully committing to it. "I didn't know who you were, and I made an assumption. That was my mistake." The room that could hear him was listening. Victor understood this and had phrased accordingly. The apology was for Adrien, but the performance was for everyone else. Adrien looked at him for a moment. There was nothing hostile in the look, but there was nothing accommodating in it either. When he spoke, his voice was the same level, unhurried register it had been all evening. "I'm not bothered by what you said," Adrien told him. "That's not the part I noticed." Victor's smile held, but something behind it recalculated. "What part did you notice?" Adrien didn't answer immediately. He looked briefly at Charlotte, and when he spoke, it was without any particular emphasis, as though he were simply stating something that happened to be true. "When you started talking, most people near the floor stepped back. It gave everyone room to watch without being involved. Adrien's attention returned to Victor with the same even quality. She didn't step back. She stayed where she was. That's the part I noticed. Victor said nothing. The smile remained on his face by force of habit, but it had lost its function. It was just an expression now unconnected to anything working behind it. Charlotte stood very still. She had not expected to be made the subject of the sentence, and the directness of it, the absence of any theatrical framing, landed differently than a compliment would have. It wasn't flattery. It was an observation delivered with the same precision he had probably used to evaluate everything else in the room that evening. She wasn't sure whether to feel recognized or assessed, and the uncertainty of that distinction was its own kind of information. Victor excused himself shortly after. He didn't leave the ballroom. That would have been too obvious a concession, but he retreated to a different section of the room, and the men who had been standing with him redistributed themselves with the quiet efficiency of people who understand when an alliance has expired. Charlotte watched him go. She had spent a year of her life with that man, a year of dinners and events and conversations in which she had gradually understood that Victor's generosity had always been conditional, always contingent on the existence of a favorable audience. She had known this for some time. Watching it demonstrated in real time in a room full of people who were now very carefully not looking at him was something different from knowing it. It was confirmation without comfort. The men who had come in through the main doors were still waiting. Adrien turned toward them and then looked back at Charlotte. 5 minutes, he said, and it wasn't clear whether he was explaining or asking her to wait. She didn't answer. She watched him move across the room toward the waiting executives, and she stayed where she was standing in the middle of the ballroom floor, in a room that had rearranged itself completely in the space of 10 minutes, trying to determine whether the ground beneath her had actually shifted, or whether she was only now noticing that it had always been unsteady. She didn't move from the center of the floor right away. The room had reorganized itself around the new information, and Charlotte stood in the middle of that reorganization, like someone who had not yet decided which direction to walk. The executives had drawn Adrien toward a set of chairs near the far wall, and the conversation there was quiet, contained entirely removed from the spectacle of the past 20 minutes. She watched it from a distance and tried to locate herself within the evening's revised geography. What she noticed more than anything else was the way people were now looking at her. Not the way they had looked at her while Victor was talking. That had been a look of mild, detached entertainment, the look of people watching something they didn't need to be invested in. This was different. Several guests who hadn't acknowledged her presence earlier in the evening were now making eye contact with the deliberate, significant warmth of people who wanted to be remembered as friendly. A man she didn't recognize nodded at her as he passed the knot, carrying a weight it had no business carrying. 2 women near the champagne station were watching her with expressions that calculated without concealing the calculation. Charlotte understood what she was seeing. She had worked in rooms like this long enough to recognize the specific moment when someone's proximity to influence becomes a currency. She had just become in the span of 10 minutes worth knowing, not because anything about her had changed, but because of who was now standing on the other side of the room and had spoken 4 sentences in her direction. The thought settled in her chest with a flatness she hadn't expected. She had stayed on the floor because it was the right thing to do, and now the room was preparing to reward her for it, and the reward felt like a different kind of insult. She collected her champagne glass from the table where she'd left it earlier and moved toward the quieter periphery of the room, away from the main floor, away from the recalibrated attention. She needed a moment of her own accounting. Victor was visible from where she stood, positioned near the entrance corridor, no longer at the center of any conversation. The men who had laughed with him had dispersed into other groups, absorbed into the room's general traffic with the efficient indifference of people who understand sunk costs. Victor himself had the look of a man engaged in a performance of nonchalance, phone in hand, posture, relaxed, projecting an ease that was slightly too precise to be real. She had seen that performance before. She knew what it meant. It meant he was aware of exactly how the room currently perceived him and was calculating what it would cost to recover. She didn't feel satisfaction watching it. She had expected to feel something closer to satisfaction, given the specific texture of the things he'd said from across the ballroom floor. What she felt instead was something quieter, a recognition not of victory, but of clarity. This was who Victor had always been. She had simply been given a room full of witnesses and a particularly clean set of circumstances to confirm it. The meeting near the far wall concluded in less time than she expected. She saw the 4 executives stand in sequence, each shaking Adrien's hand, and then they moved toward the side exit with the same purposeful efficiency with which they had arrived. Adrien remained where he was for a moment, alone in the chair, looking at nothing in particular. Then he stood and crossed the room toward her. Charlotte watched him come and felt the same thing she'd felt when the executives first walked through the main doors, the need to recalibrate the slight disorientation of a familiar thing revealing an unfamiliar dimension. He walked the same way he'd been standing all evening. Nothing had changed in his posture or his pace. The information the room now held about him hadn't altered how he moved through it, and that specific consistency was, she realized, more telling than anything else she had observed about him in the past 2 hours. He stopped at a comfortable distance and looked at her with the same directness he'd used all evening. "I want to explain something," Adrien said. "Not because I owe you an explanation, but because I think you've earned an honest one." Charlotte kept her expression open and said nothing. "I come to events like this without the title," he said. "I have for years. It started as practical. I got better information from people who didn't know who I was. But it became something else over time. It became the only reliable way I know to understand what I'm actually dealing with." He looked at the room briefly, then back at her. Most people, when they figure it out, treat the earlier version of the conversation like a rough draft, like it was practice for the real introduction. They recalibrate, and the recalibration tells me everything I need to know. Charlotte considered that. "And the ones who don't recalibrate, they're rare enough that I remember them," Adrien said. She let that sit for a moment without filling it. Around them, the room continued its evening quieter, now the energy settling from the earlier spike into the more sustainable hum of people who had processed the main event and returned to their secondary purposes. The quartet had moved into something slower again, the melody unhurried and unobtrusive. "I need to ask you something," Charlotte said. "And I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one." Adrien indicated that she should ask. Did it matter? The actual person, me specifically, or just the fact that I was one of the ones who didn't move? The question was direct, and she had asked it because she needed the distinction. She had spent a year with a man who valued her primarily as a reflection of his own choices, and the lesson of that year had been that flattery and genuine regard can wear identical faces until the moment they don't. She was not going to step into another situation without asking the question the situation required. Adrien didn't answer immediately, and she was glad he didn't, because an immediate answer would have told her something she didn't want to know. "Both," he said finally. The behavior was the door. "You're what's on the other side of it." Charlotte held his gaze. She believed him, not because she wanted to, not because the evening had been constructed to produce a particular outcome, but because nothing in his manner, across 2 hours of observation, had given her a reason to doubt the quality of his attention. He had been watching the room all evening with the same eyes he was using now, and those eyes did not appear to distinguish between the moment and what it was worth performing. "I don't want the version of tonight that the room is currently constructing," she said. "Whatever they've decided this is, I'm not interested in that version." "Neither am I," Adrien said. The crowd had thinned somewhat near the far edge of the ballroom, not empty, but spacious. The traffic having pooled around the bar and the exits, as the evening moved toward its later stages. The string quartet was still playing their audience, reduced to the few guests who had settled into genuine conversation and were no longer performing for anyone. The floor near the musicians had mostly cleared. Adrien turned slightly toward it. "One more," he said. It wasn't a request exactly, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was something closer to an offering extended without expectation available to be declined. Charlotte looked at the quiet corner of the floor, then back at him. The calculus of the evening ran briefly through her mind. The entrance she had made into this room 3 hours ago, the 1 hour she had allocated to it, the way events arranged themselves regardless of the time you'd budgeted for them. She thought about the moment on the floor when she had made the first decision, not the glamorous kind of decision, not the kind that makes a good story in the telling, but the small, unglamorous choice to stay in place when the easier thing was to step away. She had made that choice without knowing what it would cost or return. She had made it because it was consistent with something she already knew about herself, and that knowledge had been sufficient. This felt like the same kind of decision. She set her champagne glass down on the nearest flat surface and walked toward the floor. Adrien followed. There was no audience for it this time, or rather, there were people in the room, but none of them were watching in the way the room had watched earlier. The 4 or 5 couples still on the floor moved in their own orbits, occupying their own quiet corners of the music. Charlotte and Adrien moved into the space without ceremony, without announcement, without anyone's prior conclusions about what the moment meant. The music held them at a comfortable distance, and they moved within it, simply without the need to fill it with conversation or meaning or performance. The ballroom was the same room it had been at the beginning of the evening, same warm lighting, same vaulted ceiling, same waiters making their patient circuits. And it was also entirely different in the way that any space is different, once you understand what has happened inside it. Victor had left by then. She had noticed peripherally the moment he slipped out through the side corridor quietly, without the visible calculation of his earlier movements, which meant the calculation had simply become invisible rather than absent. He would recover. He was good at recovery. That was in the end the truest thing she knew about him. His talent was not for understanding his mistakes, but for surviving them. She hoped the distinction would eventually cost him something, and she released the thought before it could become the kind of thing she carried home. What she carried home instead was simpler and harder to name. A room full of people had looked at a man and seen nothing worth acknowledging, and then looked again and seen everything. The man himself had not changed between those 2 moments. Only the information had changed, and the gap between those 2 versions of the same person, the gap that the room had filled with laughter and then with deference, was exactly the measure of what the room had actually been valuing all along. Charlotte had stayed on the floor the first time because stepping off felt like agreeing to something she didn't believe. She was still on the floor now for the same reason. Nothing in the interval had changed that. The music moved through its final measures. The room settled into itself. And in a quiet corner of the Meridian Grand Ballroom, 2 people who had told each other the truth in a room built for performance simply continued to move without hurry and without an audience that mattered.